What if the Emperor of Mankind came into our universe? Will humanity embrace its immortal guardian? Or will our world become the final battlefield in a war that has raged across 10,000 years? The golden light came first, a radiance that defied physics and seared through the quantum foam of reality itself. It manifested in the heart of the Vatican during an ordinary Wednesday Mass in St. Peter's Basilica, a tear in the fabric of existence, vertical and shimmering like a knife wound in the air, split the space between the altar and Bernini's bronze baldachin. Cardinals froze mid-prayer. Tourists captured the impossible on 1,000 phone cameras. The faithful fell to their knees. Through this wound in reality stepped a being of such presence that reality itself seemed to bend around him. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, clad in armor that reflected no known metal on Earth, with a face that somehow contained all human features, and none, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. His eyes held galaxies. His brow bore the weight of eons. In one hand, he carried a flaming sword that seemed to weep fire rather than burn with it. In the other, a staff topped with a 2-headed eagle of gold. The Emperor of Mankind had arrived on Terra, but not his Terra. "This is not as it should be," he spoke, his voice both a whisper and a thunderclap that shattered every stained glass window in the basilica simultaneously. Blood trickled from the ears of those nearest to him. "I sense no astronomicon, no warp storms. The Imperium lies nearly dormant here." Guards rushed forward, their training overriding their awe. The Emperor regarded them with something approaching pity. With the merest flicker of his consciousness, their weapons turned to dust in their hands. Not through any technology, but through the sheer psychic might of one who had guided humanity for millennia in another timeline. "I would speak with your leaders," the Emperor commanded, his psychic voice now modulated to avoid further harm. "This Terra requires my attention." Within hours, global communications networks collapsed under the weight of the impossible footage streaming from Rome. Military satellites captured the golden figure as he stepped out onto St. Peter's Square, where a crowd of thousands had already gathered, drawn by an unconscious psychic call they could not name but could not resist. In Beijing, the Politburo convened an emergency session. In Washington, the president was rushed to a secure bunker. In Moscow, military doctrine shifted to high alert. But the preparations were meaningless. Humanity was encountering its first truly post-human entity, and no protocol existed for such an event. The Emperor stood before the masses, his radiance causing camera lenses to crack and distort, and he began to scan the minds of all humanity simultaneously, his psychic powers extending across the globe like golden tendrils, touching every human consciousness. What he discovered shook even his ancient, immovable will. This Terra had never known him. This humanity had never been guided by his hand. And the horrors that plagued his galaxy, the Chaos Gods, the Xenos threats, lay dormant or entirely absent. This was a virgin timeline untouched by the Great Crusade or the Horus Heresy or the 10,000 years of grinding war that had followed. Most disturbing of all, he found no trace of chaos corruption, no whisper of the ruinous powers. In this reality, the warp was calm, almost placid, reflecting only the dreams and nightmares of an innocent species not yet touched by true horror. The Emperor made his first decision. He would reshape this Terra as he had once reshaped his own during the forgotten age of strife. But this time there would be no mistakes, no treacherous sons, no hidden agendas among his confidants. This humanity would receive the gift of his guidance, pure and undiluted. The age of superstition and division was over. The true age of the Emperor had begun. In the following days, attempts to contain or control the Emperor proved laughably inadequate. A squadron of fighter jets dispatched to enforce Italian airspace disintegrated into their component atoms when they approached too close to his psychic aura. A cruise missile launched by a panicked regional commander reversed course mid-air and buried itself harmlessly in the Mediterranean. The Emperor walked north from Rome, his every step causing reality to shimmer and recalibrate around him. Behind him followed the first of his new disciples, tens of thousands strong, their minds linked in a gestalt of purpose that overrode individual will. Former bankers walked alongside former beggars, Ex-criminals marched in perfect unison with former judges. The Emperor's psychic dominance erased old divisions and forged new neural pathways dedicated to a single purpose, the unification of Terra. At the French border, an armored division awaited. The commander, a veteran of 3 wars, stood his ground as the Golden Giant approached. He had orders to prevent any incursion, to hold the line against what many governments now classified as an extraterrestrial threat. "You serve bravely," the Emperor acknowledged, his voice causing the very air to vibrate. "But you serve the wrong masters." The commander raised his hand to order the first volley of warning shots. His arm froze mid-gesture, not through paralysis, but through sudden and complete understanding. In an instant, the Emperor had transferred a fragment of his cosmic vision directly into the man's mind. The commander saw the trajectory of human history, the petty squabbles and self-destruction that had characterized millennia of development. And he saw an alternative, a path of unity and purpose under the golden light of the one true human leader. Tears streaming down his face, the commander ordered his forces to stand down. Many joined the growing procession. As the Emperor continued his inexorable march toward Paris, the world's intelligence agencies scrambled to make sense of what satellite imagery revealed. A being of impossible power, a growing army without weapons but with absolute devotion, and the systematic collapse of resistance wherever this force moved. Conventional military doctrine proved useless. This was not an invasion. It was a conversion. In Manhattan, the United Nations Security Council convened in permanent emergency session. Representatives from the major powers argued bitterly over classification and response. Was this a religious event? A first contact scenario? A mass psychosis? The debates became increasingly academic as more countries reported the same phenomenon. Citizens walking away from their lives, drawn toward Europe by a call that transcended language and culture. The Emperor's psychic reach continued to expand. Those with latent psychic abilities, the rare humans in this universe with untapped potential, began experiencing visions of a golden throne, a united human empire spanning the stars, and the benevolent but firm guidance of the Master of Mankind. Many became his most fervent converts, their nascent powers amplified by his presence into something approaching the abilities of battle psychers from his own dimension. The first of these new psychers manifested her powers in dramatic fashion during a live television interview in London. A skeptical physicist attempting to provide a rational explanation for the events in Rome found himself confronted by a former graduate student whose eyes now blazed with golden fire. "You speak of laws that no longer apply," she declared, her voice layered with harmonic overtones that caused the studio lights to shatter. "The Emperor brings new understanding, new purpose." To demonstrate, she extended her hand toward a glass of water on the table between them. The liquid rose in defiance of gravity, forming a perfect replica of the two-headed imperial Aquila before bursting into flame that burned gold instead of orange. Similar manifestations occurred globally, most notably among the young. In Seoul, a teenager levitated 3 meters above his high school track during a running event. In Lagos, a medical student healed a terminal cancer patient with a touch, her hands glowing with the same golden light that surrounded the Emperor. In Seattle, a software engineer accurately predicted 3 major earthquakes, claiming the Emperor had granted him the ability to sense the patterns of planetary movement. These emerging psychers became the Emperor's vanguard, his message amplified through their newfound abilities, and his message was consistent. Humanity had lost its way through division, and only through unity of purpose could it achieve its destined greatness among the stars. World leaders who attempted to resist found their efforts strangely stymied. Electronic communications discussing opposition to the Emperor's advance became garbled or failed entirely. Military units dispatched to contain his followers found themselves overcome with a profound sense of purpose that aligned perfectly with the Emperor's goals. It wasn't mind control in the conventional sense. It was more insidious, a fundamental rewriting of human priorities at the neurological level. As the Emperor approached Paris, the first organized resistance finally materialized. Not from governments, which were increasingly paralyzed by internal divisions and defections, but from religious organizations that recognized an existential threat to their worldviews. An unlikely coalition of fundamentalist groups from across the theological spectrum had established a blockade on the outskirts of the city. Armed with nothing more than their faith and their holy texts, several thousand believers formed a human chain across the emperor's path. Their leaders, clad in the vestments and symbols of a dozen different faiths, stood at the forefront, prepared to challenge divinity with divinity. The emperor halted his procession. For the first time since his arrival, something approaching sorrow crossed his perfect features. He recognized this moment from his own history, the confrontation with the entrenched beliefs that had held humanity back from its true potential. "You who claim to speak for higher powers," he addressed them, his voice now controlled to avoid causing physical harm. "What gods do you serve that would deny humanity its birthright among the stars?" A Catholic cardinal stepped forward, his aged hands trembling but his voice firm. "We serve the one true God who teaches love and forgiveness, not domination." Beside him, an imam nodded in rare agreement. "Allah guides us toward peace and submission to his will, not to the will of a man, no matter how powerful." The emperor's expression remained unchanged, but something shifted in the golden light that emanated from him. It became penetrating, analytical, revealing the core truths behind the words. "I have lived 10,000 lifetimes," the emperor responded, his voice now gentle but unyielding. "I have worn the masks of every deity humanity has ever worshipped. I have been your Messiah, your prophet, your Buddha, your Krishna." These were necessary guises for a species not yet ready to comprehend the truth. With a gesture that seemed almost regretful, he extended his consciousness toward the gathered religious leaders, not to harm them, but to show them. In an instant, they experienced a compressed version of the emperor's own memories. His birth during humanity's prehistoric dawn, his careful, millennial-long guidance of human development, his countless interventions throughout history, sometimes as leader, sometimes as advisor, always working toward a single goal: human ascendancy in a hostile cosmos. Many fell to their knees, their theological certainties shattered by direct contact with a being who had lived the histories they had only read about. Others stood firm, their faith bending but not breaking under the weight of revelation. A Baptist minister, his eyes wide with the visions he had just experienced, found his voice first. "If what you show us is true, then you have deceived mankind for millennia. You have played God." "No," the emperor corrected. "I have never claimed godhood. I have only ever been what I am, the guardian of humanity's destiny. It is humans who insisted on deifying what they could not understand." As the theological confrontation unfolded, military satellites detected a new development. The tear in reality through which the emperor had entered this universe had not closed. Instead, it had stabilized and was now fluctuating rhythmically like a heartbeat. Measurement instruments deployed by the European Space Agency recorded energy signatures that defied known physics, suggesting that the barrier between universes was growing thinner. In orbit, the International Space Station captured images of atmospheric disturbances centered above the Emperor's position. Golden aurora-like patterns spread across the upper atmosphere, visible even in daylight. Astronauts reported strange dreams and a persistent humming that seemed to emanate from the direction of Earth whenever the station passed over Europe. The Emperor, aware of the dimensional instability but choosing to focus on the immediate challenge before him, continued his dialogue with the religious coalition. Many had already laid down their symbols of faith, overcome by the weight of direct contact with his consciousness. But a core group remained resistant, their beliefs too deeply ingrained to be overturned even by psychic truth. "You ask us to abandon faiths that have sustained humanity through its darkest hours," challenged a Hindu Swami, his eyes fierce with conviction. "What do you offer in their place?" "Purpose," the Emperor replied simply. Not the promise of reward after death, but meaning in life. Not division based on competing mythologies, but unity based on our shared human potential. The stars await us, but we cannot reach them while fighting amongst ourselves over whose imagined deity holds the truth. As he spoke, the first physical manifestation of his power on a planetary scale became apparent. Across the globe, in every major city and remote village, the same phenomenon occurred simultaneously. For 3 minutes and 33 seconds, every human, shadow aligned in the same direction, pointing toward Paris regardless of the position of the sun. Even in darkness, even indoors, human shadows manifested and oriented toward the Emperor's position. The global telecommunications network, already strained by weeks of unprecedented activity, collapsed completely under the weight of 7 billion simultaneous attempts to understand what had just occurred. In this momentary vacuum of connectivity, the Emperor made his move. With a thought, he established a psychic network that bypassed technology entirely. Every human on the planet simultaneously heard his voice in their minds, speaking in their native language with the intimacy of a trusted friend. "Children of Terra," he began, "you stand at the crossroads of your destiny. For too long, you have been divided by borders, by beliefs, by the artificial constructs of nation and creed. These divisions have kept you planet-bound while the galaxy awaits your rightful dominion." The message continued, laying out a vision of human unification and advancement that resonated at the deepest levels of consciousness. It was not mind control, for the Emperor had learned from his own timeline that forced compliance bred only resentment and eventual rebellion. Instead, it was persuasion on a scale, and with a precision never before experienced in this universe. When the psychic broadcast concluded, the world had fundamentally changed, not through conquest, but through conversion. Governments remained intact, but their priorities had shifted. Religious organizations continued to exist, but many now reinterpreted their texts as allegorical predictions of the Emperor's arrival. The machinery of human civilization continued to function, but now with a unified purpose: preparation for the Emperor's grand vision. The resistance at Paris dissolved not through conflict, but through understanding. The Emperor continued his physical journey, now moving toward Brussels, the symbolic heart of European unification efforts. His procession had swelled to millions, with followers joining from every nation and walk of life. But as the Emperor reshaped human society through his mere presence, the tier in reality continued to widen. And through that widening gap, something else was beginning to take notice of this virgin universe and its powerful new inhabitant. In the warp of the Emperor's home dimension, the Chaos Gods stirred. A universe without their influence, with billions of untainted human souls and a newly active psychic potential awakening throughout the population, represented an opportunity too tempting to ignore. The Emperor had inadvertently created a beacon that shone across dimensions, drawing the attention of entities whose nature was antithetical to his plans for ordered human advancement. The first sign came not on Earth but on Mars. Astronomers observed an impossible atmospheric change, a brief swirling pattern of red energy that formed the distinct shape of a stylized skull before dissipating. Spectrographic analysis showed compounds that couldn't exist naturally, including trace elements of what appeared to be blood. The Emperor, engaged in reshaping Earth's scientific understanding to prepare for the technologies of his own timeline, sensed the disturbance immediately. His expression, witnessed by millions of his followers gathered in the great square of Brussels, changed from serene certainty to something approaching concern. "It begins sooner than expected," he murmured, and those nearest to him felt a chill of premonition. The Imperium stirs. With a thought, he dispatched the most powerful of his new psychers to establish monitoring stations at key locations around the globe, particularly at places where the veil between realities had always been naturally thin: the Bermuda Triangle, the Devil's Sea east of Japan, certain points along the Earth's ley lines where ancient cultures had built their most significant monuments. Reports soon confirmed his concern. At each location, instruments registered increasing fluctuations in background radiation, gravitational constants, and other measurements that indicated dimensional instability. More disturbing were the psychological effects reported by those stationed at these monitoring points. Nightmares of impossible geometries, auditory hallucinations of whispered promises, and in some cases spontaneous manifestation of previously latent psychic abilities oriented toward destruction rather than creation. The Emperor, still physically present in Brussels but with his consciousness extended across the planet, made a strategic decision. He would accelerate his timeline. Earth's technology would need to advance by centuries within months if humanity was to have any chance against what might come through the widening breach. In Silicon Valley, the world's leading tech executives found themselves summoned to an emergency conclave. The Emperor did not physically attend, but his presence filled the conference room in the form of a golden light that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Through a chosen spokesperson, one of his newly elevated human representatives, he laid out designs for technologies that existed only in his home timeline. Void shields capable of protecting entire cities, warp engines that could propel ships between stars, weapons that could disrupt not just matter, but the underlying fabric of reality itself. The physics of your universe allows for these developments, the Emperor explained through his conduit. You have simply lacked the vision to pursue them. That changes now. The technological revolution that followed was unprecedented. Major corporations, their competitive instincts subordinated to the Emperor's unified vision, shared breakthroughs freely. Research facilities operated around the clock, their scientists driven by a mixture of inspiration and the subtle psychic encouragement of the Emperor's growing circle of psyker disciples. Within weeks, the first prototypes of Emperor-inspired technology emerged. A demonstration at CERN revealed a containment field that could temporarily separate a small volume of space from the normal laws of physics, the first step toward the Geller fields that would eventually protect human ships traversing the Imperium. In Japan, a consortium of electronics manufacturers unveiled a crystalline computing substrate that processed information through quantum entanglement rather than electronic signals, exponentially more powerful than traditional silicon. The most significant advancement came in the field of human enhancement. Drawing on his knowledge of how space marines were created in his own timeline, the Emperor directed medical researchers to develop gene therapies that could elevate baseline humans toward their maximum potential. The treatments were voluntary, but wildly popular, particularly among the military forces that were now being reorganized into the first iteration of the Imperial Army. These enhanced soldiers, though far from the transhuman space marines of the Emperor's home dimension, represented a significant evolutionary step forward. Stronger, faster, more resilient to disease and injury, they became the visible symbols of humanity's new direction. Clad in prototype armor that incorporated the most advanced material science could produce, they assumed responsibility for protecting the sites where reality had grown thin. But for every action there is a reaction. As humanity advanced under the Emperor's guidance, the forces that had taken notice from beyond the dimensional tier marshaled their own response. The incursions began subtly at first, easily mistaken for psychological phenomena rather than actual breaches. In a remote monitoring station in northern Siberia, 3 enhanced soldiers reported the same dream on the same night, a garden where the plants bled when cut and whispered promises of eternal life. They awoke to find actual roses growing through the concrete floor of their barracks, each bloom a riot of impossible colors and nauseating symmetry. When a botanist attempted to take samples, the plants released spores that transformed the unfortunate scientist's body into a garden of flesh that continued to grow even after death. Similar incidents occurred at other monitoring stations. In Australia's outback, Geometric patterns appeared spontaneously on the skin of personnel, rearranging themselves when not observed directly. Near the Nazca lines in Peru, gravity reversed, itself in a perfect sphere 5 meters in diameter, causing equipment and personnel to fall upward into a vortex that seemed to lead somewhere else before the Emperor's psychers contained the anomaly. These incursions, while concerning, were merely precursors. The true threat materialized 6 months after the Emperor's arrival, as humanity was still struggling to adapt to its new unified purpose and the radical technological changes reshaping society. The breach occurred at what had once been CERN, but was now the primary Imperial research facility focused on understanding and potentially controlling the dimensional tear. Scientists had been experimenting with a device designed to take readings from the other side of the reality breach, effectively creating a dimensional periscope. What they saw defied sanity, a realm of pure psychic energy where thoughts manifested as physical laws, where emotion shaped reality, and where great powers moved with malevolent intelligence. Worse, the device didn't just observe, it created a temporary connection, a microscopic wormhole through which influence could flow both ways. That was all the opportunity the Chaos God Tzinch, the Changer of Ways, required. Through this pinprick in reality, the merest fraction of his consciousness extended into the virgin universe. It manifested as a cascade of blue-purple flames that consumed not matter but possibility itself. The entire CERN facility, along with a significant portion of the surrounding Swiss countryside, transformed. Reality rewrote itself according to the whims of a being who embodied change and sorcery. Physical laws operated differently within the affected zone. Probability ceased to function linearly. Those caught in the transformation found their bodies and minds altered based on their innermost desires and fears, creating chimeric entities that were both human and something altogether alien. The Emperor felt the breach instantly, a psychic scream that transcended physical distance. For the first time since his arrival, genuine alarm registered on his perfect features. This was no longer a theoretical threat. It was an actual incursion by one of the very beings whose influence he had spent millennia combating in his home dimension. He departed Brussels immediately, his physical form dissolving into pure golden energy that reconstructed itself moments later at the edge of what Imperial authorities were already designating a chaos zone. What he witnessed confirmed his worst fears. The virgin warp of this universe was being corrupted, its calm surface rippled by the touch of a malevolent intelligence from outside. The former CERN facility had become a twisted parody of its former self. The Large Hadron Collider had reconfigured into a massive sigil etched into the earth, its shape drawing energy from the altered reality within the zone. At its center stood what had once been the lead scientist, now transformed into a cackling sorcerer whose flesh constantly shifted between states of matter, his mind fractured into 9 separate personalities that all spoke simultaneously. The Changer of Ways extends his greetings, anathema, the transformed scientist spoke, using the title by which the Chaos Gods had always referred to the Emperor. How generous of you to discover a fresh universe for us to inhabit, unmarked by our previous conflicts. The Emperor did not deign to respond with words. Instead, his sword of flaming energy materialized in his hand, and he struck with the speed of thought itself. The blade passed through the sorcerer's mutating form, severing not just his physical body, but his connection to the warp energy animating his transformation. The sorcerer collapsed, momentarily restored to human form in death. But the Chaos Zone itself remained, a beachhead from which Tzinch's influence continued to spread. The Emperor could sense the dimensional tear widening further in response to the Chaos God's attention, threatening to allow an even greater manifestation of warp energy into this universe. Without hesitation, the Emperor extended his full psychic might toward the breach. Golden energy met blue-purple warp fire at the quantum boundary between dimensions. The collision of opposing forces created a shockwave that flattened forests for kilometers in every direction and registered on seismographs around the world. For 3 days and nights, the Emperor maintained his psychic barrier, containing Tzeentch's influence within the Chaos Zone, while simultaneously working to seal the breach the Chaos God was exploiting. The strain would have annihilated any lesser psyker, but the Emperor had faced down the unified might of all 4 Chaos Gods during the Horus Heresy in his home dimension. By comparison, this fragment of Tzeentch's power was manageable, if still dangerous. On the dawn of the 4th day, the Emperor emerged from his psychic battle victorious, but visibly affected. The breach had been sealed, the direct connection to Tzeentch severed, but the Chaos Zone remained, a scar on reality where the laws of physics had been permanently altered. And worse, the main dimensional tear, the one through which the Emperor himself had entered this universe, had grown more unstable during the conflict. Imperial scientists, operating from a hastily established perimeter around the Chaos Zone, reported alarming findings. The altered region was slowly expanding, converting normal spacetime into warp-touched reality at a rate of several millimeters per hour. Without intervention, the entire planet would be consumed within decades. More immediately concerning, the affected zone was having a psychic impact far beyond its physical boundaries. Sensitive individuals within a 1,000-kilometer radius reported dreams of labyrinths that reconfigured themselves, of books whose text changed between readings, and of a great manipulative intelligence offering forbidden knowledge in exchange for devotion. The Emperor, his physical form now stationed permanently at the Imperial Command Center established in Geneva, directed the deployment of the first generation of technology derived from his knowledge. A containment perimeter was established around the Chaos Zone, consisting of pylons that projected a simplified version of the null fields used by the Sisters of Silence in his home dimension. These pylons, while crude by the standards of the 41st Millennium, served to slow the zone's expansion and dampen its psychic emanations, but they were a stopgap measure at best. The Emperor knew that this incursion was merely the first. Where one Chaos God had found entry, others would follow. And indeed, signs of further corruption began to manifest globally. In a slum district of Rio de Janeiro, a plague of impossible virulence erupted, its victims developing symptoms that defied medical understanding, bodily fluids that moved with apparent intelligence, infections that seemed to experience joy, necrotic tissue that remained animate and responsive to stimuli. The psychic signature was unmistakable to the Emperor's enhanced senses. Nurgle, the Chaos God of disease and decay, had found his own pathway into this virgin universe. Simultaneously, in the war-torn regions of Central Africa, where decades of conflict had created a psychic imprint of violence and bloodshed, something new emerged on the battlefield. Combatants from all factions reported encountering a warrior of impossible proportions and strength, clad in brass armor adorned with skulls, who appeared wherever combat was thickest. Those who survived encounters described how the entity seemed to feed on the violence itself, growing more substantial with each life taken. Khorne, the blood god, had found his foothold. The pattern was completing itself. The Emperor recognized with grim certainty that the 4th Chaos God would not be far behind. Slaanesh, the Prince of Excess, would seek entry through humanity's pursuit of pleasure and perfection, through the extremes of sensation and emotion that had always been the youngest Chaos God's domain. Facing a multifaceted threat that was expanding faster than humanity's ability to counter it, the Emperor made a strategic decision. It was time to create his first space marines in this universe, to forge transhuman warriors capable of facing these warp entities on more equal footing. The process would be imperfect, limited by the technology currently available and the need for rapid deployment. But the Emperor had created the first Thunder Warriors during the unification wars on his Terra with far fewer resources. He would adapt the process, accepting limitations in exchange for immediate reinforcement. From among the enhanced soldiers who had already received the first generation of gene therapy, the Emperor selected 500 candidates. The criteria were exacting: psychological stability, physical excellence, and most crucially, resistance to the psychic corruption emanating from the chaos incursions. These proto-Astartes underwent a brutal augmentation process at a facility established in the Rocky Mountains, isolated from population centers in case of catastrophic failure. The modifications were crude compared to the refined process that had created the Legiones Astartes of the Emperor's home dimension, but they were effective. Organ implantation, skeletal reinforcement, muscle density enhancement, and aggressive hypno-indoctrination transformed the candidates into warriors who stood halfway between human and the true space marines of the 41st millennium. The casualties were high. Of the 500 who entered the process, only 300 survived to become the Emperor's first battle-ready transhuman force in this new universe. They received no power armor, for the technology to create it properly did not yet exist. Instead, they wore combat suits cobbled together from the most advanced materials available, offering protection roughly equivalent to carapace armor from the Emperor's original timeline. Their weapons, too, were primitive approximations. No bolters existed in this universe, so they carried railguns that accelerated metal projectiles to hypersonic velocities using electromagnetic principles. For close combat, they wielded monomolecular blades energized with the best power sources available, pale shadows of the power weapons used by Space Marines in the 41st millennium, but deadly nonetheless. What they lacked in equipment, they made up for in purpose and the direct psychic guidance of the Emperor himself. Each of these proto-Astartes received a fraction of the Emperor's own power, a tiny spark of his divine essence that connected them directly to his will and protected them somewhat from chaos corruption. They called themselves the Vanguard, the first of what the Emperor intended, to be a new Imperium in this untainted universe. And their baptism of fire came soon after their creation, as the Nurgle incursion in Rio de Janeiro reached critical levels, threatening to spread beyond the containment efforts of conventional forces. The deployment of the Vanguard to the Nurgle-corrupted favelas of Rio marked the first true battle between the forces of the Emperor and chaos in this virgin universe. It was a bloody, desperate affair fought in narrow alleyways and crumbling concrete, structures where the laws of physics had begun to shift and biological matter reconfigured itself. According to Nurgle's putrid vision, the Vanguard moved with transhuman speed and coordination, their enhanced physiology allowing them to engage entities that would have overwhelmed normal humans within seconds. They fought methodically, with bolts of golden psychic energy occasionally manifesting around their weapons as the Emperor's essence within them reacted to the proximity of chaotic corruption. At the heart of the favela, they discovered the locus of the incursion, a former community health clinic that had transformed into a throbbing organic structure that more resembled a massive organ than a building. Within its pulsating chambers, a great unclean one was beginning to manifest, its form still partially incorporeal, but growing more solid with each passing hour as it fed on the suffering and decay around it. The proto-Astartes of the Vanguard established a perimeter and called for reinforcement. This entity was beyond their capability to destroy in their current form. They needed the Emperor himself, or at minimum the most powerful of his Psyker disciples. The Emperor, still recovering from his confrontation with Tzeentch's incursion, dispatched instead the first formation of what would eventually become this universe's Sisters of Battle. Not the power-armored, faith-driven warriors of the 41st millennium, but rather the most powerful of the female psychers who had manifested abilities. After his arrival, trained in focusing their powers through disciplined mantras that resembled prayers but functioned as psychic formulae, these daughters of the Emperor, as they had named themselves, arrived at Rio via VTOL aircraft that served as primitive versions of the eventual Thunderhawk gunships. Clad in combat gear inscribed with symbols that channeled and focused psychic energy, they brought with them artifacts that the Emperor had personally empowered, crystalline devices that served as psychic amplifiers, allowing them to project his power into the corrupted zone. The combined assault of the Vanguard's physical might and the daughter's psychic assault proved sufficient to disrupt the Great Unclean One's manifestation. The creature, still forming and not yet at its full power, dissolved back into the warp energies from which it was coalescing. The organic structure that had once been a clinic collapsed in on itself, expelling a cloud of spores that the daughters incinerated with focused psychic fire before they could spread. Victory had been achieved, but at significant cost. 43 Vanguard warriors had been lost, their enhanced physiology's insufficient protection against the reality-warping powers of even a partially manifested greater demon. 17 daughters had burned out their psychic abilities entirely, their minds unable to channel the Emperor's power at the intensity required for combat against warp entities. The Emperor, monitoring the battle through his psychic connection to his forces, recognized the limitations of his current approach. Humanity in this universe, even with accelerated technological development and the beginnings of transhuman engineering, was not yet ready to face the full might of chaos. A more fundamental solution was required. The decision crystallized in his ancient mind. He would need to create a version of the Astronomicon in this universe, a psychic beacon that would both allow him to better control the dimensional tear and create a zone of relative stability in the warp around Earth, making further chaos incursions more difficult. The construction of this new Astronomicon began immediately at what had once been the United Nations headquarters in New York, now repurposed as the central administrative complex for the nascent Imperium. The building's iconic Secretariat Tower was reinforced with newly developed materials and rebuilt to the Emperor's specifications, extending higher into the atmosphere than its original design. At its summit, a chamber was prepared that echoed the golden throne room of Terra in the Emperor's home dimension, not as grand, not as powerful, but serving a similar purpose. A focus point for his immense psychic might, amplified and directed outward, not just through space, but through the dimensional membrane between universes. The Emperor's physical form took up residence in this chamber, seated upon a throne-like device that was the pinnacle of this universe's technological achievement, incorporating elements derived from his memories of the original Golden Throne. From this position, he extended his consciousness outward, establishing a psychic barrier around Earth that would make further chaos incursions more difficult and stabilize the dimensional tear that had brought him to this reality. The effort required even the Emperor to focus the majority of his attention on maintaining this psychic shield. His direct involvement in the day-to-day operations of the nascent Imperium necessarily decreased. In his place, a council of his most trusted human advisors assumed administrative control, guided by his occasional psychic communications and the continued efforts of his enhanced forces in containing the chaos incursions that had already taken hold. This Council of Terra, as it styled itself in unconscious mimicry of the administrative body from the Emperor's home dimension, consisted of the most capable human leaders who had embraced his vision. They directed the continuing technological development, the expansion of the Proto-Astartes program, and the global conversion of industry toward imperial purposes. But without the Emperor's constant direct oversight, subtle corruption began to seep into the Imperium structure. Not the overt taint of chaos, which remained largely contained by the Emperor's psychic barrier, but the more insidious corruption of human ambition, fear, and short-sightedness. Some council members began consolidating power beyond their assigned roles. Others implemented harsher measures against populations still resistant to imperial unification, justifying brutality as necessity. Resource allocation became politicized, with favored regions receiving preferential treatment, while others suffered neglect. These developments did not escape the Emperor's notice entirely, but his focus on maintaining the psychic barrier against chaos limited his ability to intervene directly in what he considered lesser concerns. Humanity would need to navigate some challenges on its own, growing through adversity as it had always done. The first true test of the nascent Imperium's resilience came not from chaos incursion, but from within. A coalition of resistance movements, comprised primarily of those who rejected the Emperor's vision of human unification, launched coordinated strikes against imperial infrastructure globally. Power distribution networks were sabotaged. Key administrators were assassinated. Communication systems were compromised with disinformation designed to erode trust in imperial authority. The attacks bore the hallmarks of sophisticated planning and unexpected technological capability. Intelligence reports suggested the involvement of elements from old national intelligence agencies that had gone underground rather than integrate into the imperial structure, combined with religious extremists who viewed the emperor as an existential threat to human spiritual freedom. The Imperium's response was decisive, but revealed concerning tendencies. Without the emperor's direct guidance, the Provisional Council authorized extreme measures, mass detentions of suspected sympathizers, the use of newly developed psycho interrogation techniques that left subjects mentally broken, deployment of proto-Astartes, vanguard against civilian targets designated as irredeemably compromised. These actions quelled the immediate uprising but created martyrs and deepened resistance among certain populations. More worryingly, they established precedents for institutional brutality that echoed the darker aspects of the Imperium from the Emperor's home dimension, the developments that had contributed to its eventual stagnation and vulnerability, to chaos. From his throne in New York, the Emperor observed these developments with growing concern. The parallels to his original timeline were becoming too pronounced. Once again, the necessities of fighting existential threats were leading humanity down a path of authoritarianism and fear-based governance. Once again, his dream of an enlightened human future was being compromised by immediate security concerns. But before he could adjust his approach, a new and unexpected development demanded his full attention. The psychic barrier he maintained around Earth registered a disturbance unlike the previous chaos incursions. This was not the corrupting influence of the ruinous powers, but something else entirely, something from his home dimension, that had followed the trail of his passage between universes. The disturbance manifested in the Antarctic, as far from major population centers as possible on the planet's surface. Imperial monitoring stations registered an energy signature that matched no known pattern, a crystalline lattice of psychic resonance that seemed to bend space itself around a central point. The Emperor immediately dispatched his elite forces, a full company of the vanguard proto-Astartes accompanied by the most powerful daughters and a contingent of newly developed tech priests, humans who had begun integrating technology directly into their bodies in imitation of the Adeptus Mechanicus, though without the religious trappings of the cult of the machine. What they discovered defied their expectations. The disturbance centered on a structure that had seemingly grown from the Antarctic ice itself, a towering crystalline obelisk that thrummed with energy, patterns identical to those emitted by the Emperor himself, but somehow inverted. Within this structure, sensors detected a single life form, humanoid but registering as even more powerful than the proto-Astartes on all measurable metrics. The Emperor, perceiving through the senses of his forces, recognized the signature immediately. It was a Primarch. One of his gene sons from the original timeline had somehow followed him through the dimensional tear, drawn by the same bonds of genetic and psychic connection that had linked them in their home universe. But which one? The question hung in the Emperor's thoughts as he directed his forces to establish a secure perimeter around the crystalline structure while he turned his full attention to the matter. The identity of the Primarch would determine whether this development represented a critical asset or a catastrophic threat to the nascent Imperium. The answer came as the crystalline structure suddenly pulsed with blinding energy, shattering to reveal the figure within. Clad in simple robes of deepest blue, his bald head marked with circuit-like patterns, and his eyes glowing with internal light, stood Magnus the Red, the Primarch of the Thousand Suns Legion. In the Emperor's home dimension, Magnus had fallen to chaos, becoming a demon prince of Tzeentch after the Horus Heresy. But this version of Magnus showed no signs of chaotic corruption. His psychic signature was pure, if alien in its complexity. "Father," Magnus addressed the Emperor directly through psychic communication, bypassing the physical distance between Antarctica and New York. "I have found you across the walls between worlds." The Emperor's response was cautious. "Magnus, you are not as I remember you. Explain your presence and your purpose." A smile crossed the Primarch's features, sad and knowing. "I am not the Magnus you knew. When the tear in reality opened and you passed through, it created echoes across multiple timelines. I am from one where the heresy took a different path, where your confrontation with Horus ended differently. In my timeline, Magnus continued, you defeated the arch-traitor but were not mortally wounded. Instead, you continued the Great Crusade, bringing all human worlds under imperial compliance. But the Chaos Gods were not defeated, merely thwarted temporarily. They found other champions, other vectors of attack. The Primarch's psychic sending conveyed not just words, but compressed memories, a version of the Imperium that had avoided 10 millennia of stagnation under the rule of a crippled emperor, but that had faced different, equally grave challenges. A timeline where the Primarchs who had remained loyal continued to serve, aging but immortal, as generals and statesmen of an expanding human empire. I followed you through the dimensional tear because I sensed what was happening, Magnus explained. The Chaos Gods have found this virgin universe, this untainted realm. They seek to corrupt it from the beginning, to establish their dominion before humanity can rise to challenge them as we did in our home dimension. The Emperor processed this information with the speed of thought. The presence of Magnus, especially a Magnus untainted by chaos, represented an invaluable resource. A second being of near-Emperor level, psychic might could significantly reinforce the barriers against further chaos, incursion, and potentially accelerate the development of psychic technology in this new Imperium, but caution was still warranted. The Emperor had been betrayed by his own gene sons before, some through malice and others through misguided good intentions. Magnus, in particular, had caused catastrophic damage to the Emperor's Webway project in the original timeline through well-meant but reckless use of his powers. Approach, the Emperor commanded, temporarily shifting his consciousness from the New York throne to manifest as a psychic projection before Magnus in Antarctica. Let me see the truth of your words. The meeting of their minds was like the collision of stars, visible to psychically sensitive individuals across the planet as a momentary aurora of gold and crimson that illuminated the entire southern hemisphere. The Emperor's consciousness enveloped Magnus's, searching for any hint of deception or corruption, while Magnus opened himself completely to his father's scrutiny. What the Emperor found satisfied him. This version of Magnus had indeed experienced a different fate than the one he remembered. This Magnus had never made his catastrophic bargain with Tzeentch, had never been corrupted by chaos, had instead grown into a mature and measured wielder of his immense psychic gifts. "You may serve at my side," the Emperor declared, withdrawing his consciousness back to its primary focus in New York. "But not as my son. In this universe I have no sons yet. You will be my advisor, my fellow guardian against the ruinous powers. We begin anew here without the weight of our shared past." Magnus bowed his head in acceptance. "As you wish, my Emperor. I bring knowledge that may prove valuable in the battles to come. The dimensional tear is more significant than you have perceived. It is not merely a passage between two universes, but a fracture point where multiple realities intersect. More will come through, both allies and enemies." This revelation gave the Emperor pause. The dimensional instability was greater than he had calculated, the potential threats more numerous, but so too were the potential resources and allies that might be drawn to this new reality. The calculations shifted in his ancient mind, strategies reconfiguring to account for this new variable. Then we must prepare, the Emperor decided, not just for the chaos incursions we have already faced, but for whatever else might emerge from the fracture between worlds. The Imperium of this universe will need to develop faster, to become stronger sooner. With Magnus now established as a second nexus of psychic power, the Emperor adjusted the configuration of the nascent Astronomicon. The Primarch took up position in a secondary facility established in the Antarctic, creating a polar counterpart to the Emperor's base in New York. Between them, they established a more sophisticated psychic network, one that could not only shield against chaos, incursion, but actively monitor the dimensional tier for new developments. The arrival of Magnus and the revelation of the true nature of the dimensional fracture marked the beginning of a new phase in the Emperor's reshaping of Earth. The pace of Technological advancement accelerated further. The Proto-Astartes program expanded with Magnus, providing insights that improved both the survival rate of candidates and the effectiveness of the final transformations. But most significantly, the presence of a second immensely powerful psychic being allowed for the implementation of a project the Emperor had previously considered impossible given the technological limitations of this universe, the creation of a limited version of the Imperial webway, drawing on Magnus's unique insights into the nature of the Imperium gained. Through his experiences in an alternate timeline, the Emperor designed a network of psychically attuned gates that could create stable passages through a carefully controlled portion of the warp. Not the vast galaxy-spanning network he had once envisioned, but a planetary system that would allow for instantaneous transportation between key Imperial facilities and eventually extend to lunar and near-Earth orbit installations. The first successful test of a webway gate, connecting the Imperial Administrative Center in New York to the Antarctic facility where Magnus had established. His base of operations represented a quantum leap in the Imperium's technological capabilities. It also provided a controlled environment for studying the nature of the warp in this universe, which remained fundamentally different from that of the Emperor's home dimension. Here, the warp was calmer, less turbulent, reflecting the psychic imprint of a humanity that had not experienced the horrors of the Age of Strife or the Wars of Secession. But it was also increasingly corrupted at specific points where the Chaos Gods had established beachheads, creating localized storms in what had once been a placid psychic sea. Through careful study of these corruption patterns, the Emperor and Magnus identified a concerning trend. The incursions were not random. They followed a geometric pattern that, when mapped onto the surface of the Earth, formed a sigil of immense complexity. Each major manifestation of chaos influence, the Tsinch corrupted zone in Switzerland, the Nurgle infestation in Rio, the Kornati battlefields of Central Africa, and a newly discovered Slaneshi corruption centered in the entertainment industries of Los Angeles, formed points on this sigil. They seek to claim this Earth as their own, Magnus observed as they studied the pattern together. Their consciousnesses linked across the thousands of kilometers separating their physical forms, not through individual corruptions as in our home dimension, but through a coordinated effort to reshape the very nature of this reality. The Emperor concurred. The pattern is a spell of sorts working on a planetary scale. If completed, it would fundamentally alter the relationship between real space and the immaterium in this universe, making the barrier between dimensions permanently permeable to their influence. The strategic implications were clear. The Imperium needed not to contain the existing chaos incursions, but to prevent new ones from establishing at the remaining points of the sigil. This necessitated a global redeployment of forces, with the most elite units positioned to guard potential manifestation sites identified through analysis of the pattern. But even as the Emperor and Magnus coordinated this defensive effort, a new complication emerged. The dimensional tear, the original rupture through which the Emperor had entered this universe, was exhibiting signs of imminent catastrophic expansion. The psychic energies being channeled through it, both from the Chaos God's efforts and from the Emperor and Magnus's own workings, had created stresses that threatened to tear it wide open. If the breach expands beyond a critical threshold, Magnus warned, the barriers between dimensions will collapse entirely. This universe and ours, and potentially many others, would bleed together, creating a roiling sea of overlapping realities where the laws of physics themselves would break down. The threat of multiversal collapse added a new urgency to the Emperor's efforts. The original plan of building a new Imperium in this virgin universe now had to accommodate the more immediate goal of preventing reality itself from unraveling. This required a fundamental shift in approach from expansion and development to containment and stabilization. The Emperor made a difficult decision. The majority of Earth's resources, which had been directed toward building the infrastructure of the new Imperium, would now be redirected toward a single massive project: the construction of a device analogous to the Golden Throne of the original timeline, but designed not to sustain the Emperor's life or power the Astronomicon, but rather to seal the dimensional breach permanently. This dimensional throne, as it came to be called, would require technology far beyond what was currently available, even with the accelerated development programs the Emperor had initiated. It would also require a level of psychic power that not even the combined might of the Emperor and Magnus could sustain indefinitely. There is only one viable solution, the Emperor concluded after countless calculations and projections. We must create more beings capable of channeling psychic energies at the required magnitude. We must accelerate the development of the psychic potential in humanity itself. The implications were profound and disturbing. In the Emperor's home dimension, the emergence of widespread psychic abilities in humanity had contributed to the catastrophes of Old Night, as untrained psychers became gateways for demonic possession and warp predation. The Emperor had spent millennia carefully guiding human evolution to control and direct this psychic awakening, only to have it derailed by the Horus heresy and its aftermath. Here he would be deliberately accelerating that process, compressing thousands of years of gradual evolution into perhaps a decade of forced development. The risks were enormous, but so too were the consequences of failure. Magnus, with his unique perspective as both a supremely powerful psyker and a being who had witnessed the consequences of unchecked psychic development, voiced his concerns. The human mind is not structured to accommodate such power without preparation. In accelerating this process, we risk creating not assets but liabilities, millions of potential gateways through which the ruinous powers could pour into this reality. The Emperor acknowledged the danger but saw no alternative. We will implement safeguards. The most promising individuals will receive direct training from you or myself. Others will be connected to the psychic network we have established, their powers channeled and controlled through that framework. Those who cannot be safely integrated will be contained. The unspoken reality of what contained would mean hung between them, the implementation of something akin to the black ships of the original timeline, identifying and collecting dangerous psychers who would then be sacrificed to power the dimensional throne. It was a grim echo of the Imperium the Emperor had left behind, a compromise of his vision for this new human future. But before this plan could be fully implemented, the dimensional tear experienced its first major expansion event. Without warning, the carefully monitored breach suddenly widened, its diameter increasing by a factor of 10 in less than an hour. The psychic shockwave knocked both the Emperor and Magnus temporarily unconscious, their immense minds overwhelmed by the sudden influx of extra-dimensional energies. Through this widened tear poured not just psychic influence but physical manifestations from other realities. The Antarctic research station where the tear had stabilized was suddenly overrun with entities from multiple timelines, demonic incursions from chaos-dominated realities, Xenos creatures from dimensions where humanity had failed to achieve dominance, and most surprisingly, human warriors in armor bearing Imperial insignia but of designs unknown even to the Emperor. These Space Marines, for they could be nothing else, despite their unfamiliar heraldry and equipment, fought with disciplined fury against the demonic and Xenos threats, establishing a defensive perimeter around the tear itself. Their armor was of a pattern more advanced than anything from the Emperor's original timeline. Their weapons similarly evolved beyond the technology he remembered. Through the chaos of battle emerged their leader, a space marine whose armor bore the symbols of high rank but no chapter affiliation that the Emperor recognized. He directed his forces with tactical precision that spoke of millennia of experience, containing the various hostiles with minimal casualties, despite being vastly outnumbered. When the immediate breach had been secured, this Space Marine commander approached the chamber where Magnus was beginning to recover from the psychic shock. Removing his helmet revealed a face aged beyond what should have been possible for an Astartes, with augmetic eyes that glowed with internal power and a web of scars that spoke of countless battles. Primarch. Magnus, he addressed the stunned Crimson. King. The Emperor protects, even across the abyssal gulf between universes. I am Chapter Master Dante of the Blood Angels, or what remains of them in the 51st millennium of our mutual home. Magnus's shock was evident even through his usually composed demeanor. The 51st millennium? But that would mean, yes, Dante confirmed. 10,000 years after the time you and the Emperor departed from our reality, the Imperium endured, after a fashion. Endured through ages of bloodshed and loss that make even the Horus heresy seem a minor prelude. Before further explanation could be offered, a psychic presence filled the chamber as the Emperor's consciousness, recovered from the shock of the breach expansion, projected itself into the Antarctic facility. The golden light of his manifestation illuminated the war-ravaged Space Marine with a radiance that seemed to momentarily strip away the weight of ages from Dante's features. Chapter. Master, the Emperor acknowledged, his psychic voice carrying recognition of the Blood Angel's commander despite never having personally met him in his original timeline. Your presence requires explanation. Dante knelt, his ancient frame moving with the fluid grace that marked all Astartes despite his apparent age. My Emperor, I come from a future where your Imperium stands at the brink of final collapse. The ruinous powers have ascended to near-complete dominance in our reality. Terra itself has fallen. The Golden Throne failed in the 49th millennium. But instead of the feared nova explosion of Terra, it created a cascade of temporal anomalies. The information struck the Emperor like a physical blow. His grand design, his 10,000-year gambit to shepherd humanity through its psychic evolution while keeping chaos at bay, had ultimately failed. The Imperium had endured far longer than he had anticipated when he had been mortally wounded by Horus, but it had still eventually succumbed. During the final battle for the solar system, Dante continued, our sensors detected a unique energy signature emanating from Antarctica. Investigation revealed a temporal dimensional anomaly identical to the one through which you and the Primarch Magnus had disappeared millennia earlier. According to certain suppressed historical texts recovered from the deepest vaults of Mars, the tech priests of what remained of the Mechanicus theorized that this represented a potentially stable passage to another reality and one untainted by the total dominion of chaos. As the last, significant loyalist force remaining, my fleet was tasked with securing this passage and, if possible, making contact with you across the dimensional gulf. The implications were staggering. Not only had the Emperor's presence in this new universe drawn the attention of the Chaos Gods, but it had created a beacon for desperate survivors from the dying Imperium of his home dimension. The dimensional tear was becoming a nexus point between multiple realities, all converging on this virgin Earth. How many came through with you? The Emperor inquired, already calculating the strategic value of having experienced Astartes warriors to reinforce the relatively untested Proto-Astartes vanguard of this timeline. 49. Astartes from a dozen different chapters, Dante reported with precise detail, plus approximately 20,000 human personnel, primarily militarum veterans, tech priests, and a small contingent of Sisters of Battle. We also brought as much equipment and technology as could be salvaged before Terra fell, including STC fragments that may prove valuable in accelerating this universe's imperial development. The Emperor's consciousness expanded to encompass the entire Antarctic facility, taking stock of these unexpected reinforcements. What he found was both encouraging and concerning. These were indeed Astartes of exceptional quality, veterans of countless campaigns against both chaotic and Xenos threats. But they were also deeply indoctrinated in the religious veneration of the Emperor that had developed after his internment on the Golden Throne, a philosophy at odds with his intentions for this new Imperium. More worryingly, there were subtle signs of warp exposure among some of the human contingent. Not full corruption, but the early indicators of chaos influence that might blossom under the right conditions. These survivors had lived their entire lives in a reality where the warp was a roiling sea of malevolence. They had brought some of that taint with them, like refugees carrying the seeds of a disease they had become partially immune to, but which could devastate a new population. Yet despite these concerns, the arrival of experienced forces with advanced technology represented a significant advantage in the immediate crisis. The Emperor made his decision. Your forces will be integrated into the imperial structure of this timeline, he declared to Dante. Your experience fighting chaos will prove invaluable as we face similar threats here. But understand this. The Imperium I am building in this universe will not repeat the mistakes of the one you left behind. There will be no ecclesiarchy, no religious veneration of myself, no sacrifice of knowledge and progress on the altar of superstition. Dante's expression remained stoic, but a flicker of something, perhaps discomfort, perhaps doubt, crossed his ancient features. As you command, my emperor, but I must caution that the faith in your divinity has been a powerful weapon against chaos corruption for millennia. It has sustained the Imperium through its darkest hours. Faith is not the question, the emperor clarified, his psychic voice resonating with conviction. Blind faith is. Faith in humanity's potential, in our capacity to overcome any challenge through reason and unity of purpose. This I encourage. But I will not allow myself to be deified again. Not when that path led ultimately to the fall of Terra in your timeline. The discussion was interrupted by a sudden alert from the monitoring system surrounding the dimensional tear. The breach was fluctuating again, its energy signature shifting in patterns that indicated another imminent expansion. But this disturbance had a different quality from the previous one, a resonance that Magnus recognized immediately. It bears the signature of Chaos Undivided, the Crimson King warned, his single eye narrowing as he extended his senses toward the anomaly. Multiple influences intertwined, working in concert rather than in their usual competition. The implications were dire. In the Emperor's experience, the four Chaos gods rarely cooperated, their inherent natures driving them to compete for souls and influence. If they were working together, it indicated a threat of unique magnitude. Defensive positions! Dante ordered his Space Marines, the veterans moving with practiced efficiency to establish a perimeter around the fluctuating tear. The Blood Angels deployed in a primary containment formation, supported by battle brothers from the Imperial Fists, Ultramarines, and several chapters the Emperor did not recognize, likely founded long after his internment on the Golden Throne. Magnus channeled his psychic might into a barrier before the tear, a crimson shield of pure warp energy shaped and controlled by his supreme mastery. The Emperor, still primarily focused on maintaining the global psychic network from his throne in New York, nevertheless diverted a significant portion of his consciousness to reinforce Magnus's efforts. The tear expanded, though not as catastrophically as before. Through the widened breach emerged a single figure that radiated power on a scale comparable to Magnus himself. Clad in ornate power armor of midnight blue trimmed with gold, his head bare to reveal features of such terrible perfection that mortal minds struggled to process them. The being walked with the confidence of one who has already achieved victory. Magnus recoiled in recognition. Fulgrim, he named the newcomer, his voice thick with revulsion. But not as he once was. Indeed, this was Fulgrim as he had become after his corruption by Chaos. A demon Primarch ascended through the patronage of Slaanesh to become a being of both material and immaterial nature. But unlike the fragmented consciousness of the Emperor or the projected presence of Magnus, Fulgrim had physically crossed the dimensional boundary, bringing his full power to bear in this virgin universe. My, the demon Primarch spoke, his voice a symphony of pleasure and cruelty that caused several of the human personnel present to collapse, blood running from their ears and eyes. What a delightful new playground you've discovered, Father. The gods send their regards. Bolter fire erupted from the Space Marine perimeter, hundreds of mass-reactive shells converging on the demon Primarch's position. Fulgrim made no move to dodge or defend himself. The explosions enveloped him completely, obscuring his form in fire and smoke. When the barrage ceased and the smoke cleared, Fulgrim stood unmarked, his perfect features arranged in an expression of amused disappointment. Is that any way to greet your long-lost brother, Magnus? And with such primitive toys, no less. With a gesture that carried impossible grace, Fulgrim unleashed his first attack. Not a physical blow, but a psychic assault of pure sensory overload. Every human and Astartes within a 100-meter radius experienced every pleasure and pain their nervous systems were capable of producing simultaneously and at maximum intensity. Many died instantly, their minds unable to process the contradictory sensations. Others fell to their knees, incapacitated by an experience beyond mortal comprehension. Magnus's psychic barrier absorbed the worst of the attack, protecting those behind his position. But the strain showed on his features as he confronted a fellow Primarch at the height of demonic ascension. "You have made a grave miscalculation. Fulgrim," Magnus responded, gathering his psychic might for a counterattack. "This is not the dying Imperium you left behind. Here Father stands at the height of his power, and I am not the broken creature you remember." The Crimson King unleashed a bolt of concentrated warp energy, a spear of pure thought that would have annihilated a lesser entity. Fulgrim caught it with his bare hand, the energy coruscating around his perfect form before he absorbed it entirely. "Oh, I am counting on his power," Fulgrim purred, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper that nonetheless carried to every ear. "This virgin universe, this untapped potential. Do you think the gods would allow such a feast to go unclaimed? They have learned from their mistakes in our home dimension. This time they move as one." As if summoned by his words, the dimensional tear pulsed again. The Emperor, perceiving the imminent catastrophe through his psychic connection to Magnus, made a desperate decision. Leaving only a fragment of his consciousness to maintain the global psychic network from New York, he transferred the majority of his being to the Antarctic facility. Manifesting physically beside Magnus in a burst of golden radiance, the Emperor of Mankind stood revealed in his full glory, not as the enthroned corpse god of the 41st Millennium, but as the supreme being who had once walked among humanity as its guardian and guide. His armor gleamed with a light that was painful to mortal eyes. His sword blazed with fires drawn from the heart of a neutron star, and his presence caused reality itself to ripple and bow. "Fulgrim," he acknowledged the demon Primarch, his voice controlled but carrying an edge of genuine regret. "Once my son, now a slave to powers you thought to master." The demon Primarch's perfect features twisted in a snarl, the first break in his composure. "I am no slave, Father. I am ascended, perfected beyond your limited imagination. The gods have shown me pleasures and powers that your sterile vision of humanity could never accommodate. And yet here you stand, doing their bidding," the Emperor observed with devastating simplicity. "A mere herald for entities that lack the courage to face me directly." Fulgrim's response was cut short as the dimensional tear expanded again, this time disgorging not a single entity but a wave of corruption that defied classification. It was chaos in its purest form, unaligned to any specific god. A tide of mutating possibility that began to transform the Antarctic facility and everyone in it according to its own inscrutable logic. The Space Marines, who were caught in this wave, underwent horrific transformations, their gene-enhanced physiology providing little protection against direct exposure to undiluted warp energy. Some became grotesque parodies of themselves, their armor fusing with their flesh as they grew additional limbs or mouths or sensory organs that served no rational purpose. Others simply dissolved into pools of constantly shifting matter that continued to move with apparent intelligence. The Emperor raised his flaming sword, and from it erupted a wall of golden fire that held back the tide of corruption. Behind this barrier, Magnus channeled his own powers to begin evacuating the surviving loyalist forces through hurriedly established webway gates, creating a retreat path to safer Imperial facilities around the globe. Fulgrim, momentarily ignored during the chaos of the new incursion, seized his opportunity, not to attack the Emperor directly. Even a demon Primarch was not foolish enough to challenge the master of mankind at the height of his power, but to accomplish the true purpose of his appearance. From within his armor, Fulgrim withdrew an object that pulsed with its own internal corruption, a crystalline device of non-Euclidean geometry that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human eye could perceive. He thrust this device into the heart of the dimensional tear, where it fused with the very fabric of the breach. "The key is placed," Fulgrim announced with triumphant malice. "The way is opened. This universe is claimed in the name of Chaos Undivided. The Emperor, perceiving the true threat too late, abandoned the evacuation efforts to lunge toward the dimensional tear with speed that defied mortal comprehension. His flaming sword arced toward the crystalline device, intending to destroy it before its purpose could be fulfilled. But Fulgrim had anticipated this reaction. As the Emperor moved, the demon Primarch made a gesture of summoning. From the corruption tide emerged twisted forms that had once been space marines, now remade as vessels for demonic entities. They flung themselves into the Emperor's path, not with any hope of defeating him, but merely to delay him for crucial seconds. The Emperor cut through these obstacles with contemptuous ease, but the momentary delay proved sufficient. The crystalline device pulsed once, twice, and on the third pulse it shattered into 1,000,000 fragments that dispersed into the dimensional tear itself. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The tear expanded exponentially, no longer a contained breach but a full collapse of the barriers between dimensions. Through this widening gap poured not just warp energy but fragments of other realities, shards of alternate timelines, splinters of possible futures, echoes of divergent pasts. The Emperor, Magnus, and the surviving loyalist forces found themselves fighting not just against chaos corruption, but against the very disintegration of reality around them. The Antarctic continent began to break apart as different physical laws competed for dominance. Tectonic plates shifting according to contradictory gravitational influences. Fall back to the secondary containment position, the Emperor commanded, establishing a new psychic barrier that encompassed a more limited area around the primary Imperial facility. Magnus, prepare the dimensional stabilizers. We cannot close the breach, but we may still be able to contain its effects. As the Loyalists executed a fighting retreat, Fulgrim laughed with the pure joy of accomplishment. It is already too late, Father. The gods have learned patience. They do not seek to defeat you in direct battle. They seek to make this entire universe their playground. Even now, their influence spreads beyond your capacity to contain it. The demon Primarch's words carried terrible truth. The Emperor could sense through his psychic connection to the global network that similar reality fractures were beginning to manifest at each of the points where chaos had already established a foothold. Switzerland, Rio de Janeiro, Central Africa, Los Angeles. The sigil was activating, transforming from a mere pattern of corruption into a planet-wide summoning circle. The scope of the catastrophe threatened to overwhelm even the Emperor's strategic genius. This was not a battle that could be won through conventional means or even through the application of superior psychic might. It was an existential threat to reality itself, a fundamental rewriting of this universe's physical laws to accommodate the primacy of chaos. In this moment of supreme crisis, as reality itself began to unravel around them, the Emperor made his final desperate decision. If the universe itself was being corrupted at its foundations, then the only solution was to impose a new order, a new set of fundamental laws that would preserve humanity's existence even as the physical cosmos transformed. Drawing upon the full measure of his psychic might, augmented by his direct connection to the Golden Throne-like device in New York, the Emperor began to implement a contingency he had developed but never expected to use. The creation of a human-centric pocket reality, a demiplane existing partially in real space and partially in a carefully controlled section of the warp. Magnus. He communicated telepathically to his loyal son. Activate the global webway network. Maximum power full-spectrum encryption. We are implementing the ARC protocol. The Crimson King's single eye widened in shocked understanding, but he complied without question. Through their combined psychic effort, the limited webway network that had been established to connect Imperial facilities was suddenly expanded, its crystalline tunnels stretching to encompass major population centers around the globe. Simultaneously, the Proto-Astartes Vanguard and the Veteran Space Marines from the 51st Millennium moved with transhuman speed to implement the physical component of the protocol. The activation of geosynchronous, orbital platforms that had been disguised as communication satellites but were in fact massive warp field generators as chaos corruption spread across the Earth's surface. Following the sigil pattern to create a planet-wide portal for the ruinous powers, the Emperor initiated the most ambitious psychic working of his immeasurably long existence. Golden light erupted from every Imperial facility globally, forming a lattice that briefly countered the spreading corruption. Through this network, the Emperor extended his will into the very fabric of local space-time, not to destroy the chaos incursion that was now beyond even his power, but to create something new within the corruption, a pocket of ordered reality where humanity could continue to exist even as the physical universe around them succumbed to chaos. The process was catastrophic. For the existing Earth, continental shelves collapsed as portions of the planet's mass were translated into the newly forming demiplane. Oceans boiled away as their component molecules were restructured according to the Emperor's psychic template. The very atmosphere began to disperse as the planet's gravitational field fluctuated wildly between competing realities. But within this apocalypse, islands of stability formed around each major Imperial installation and population center, protected by the Emperor's psychic power and the technology of both his original timeline and the advanced knowledge brought by Dante's refugees from the 51st Millennium. These regions held firm as reality itself dissolved around them. Fulgrim, realizing too late the Emperor's strategy, attempted to disrupt the formation of this new demiplane. But he found himself confronted by Magnus, Dante, and the combined might of the Loyalist forces, all fighting with the desperate knowledge that this was humanity's last stand, not just in this universe but across all possible timelines. The battle raged across what had once been Antarctica, but was now a surreal landscape where the laws of physics rewrote themselves moment by moment. Space Marines fought alongside Proto-Astartes. Sisters of Battle united their faith-driven powers with the more scientific approaches of the tech priests. And at the center of it all, Magnus dueled his fallen brother with the full measure of his psychic might. Above this chaos, the Emperor continued his great working. His consciousness expanded to encompass the entire planet and beyond, selecting and preserving those elements of human civilization and achievement worth saving, while allowing the corrupted remainder to fall into the seething warp that now interpenetrated. Material reality, the process could not save everyone. Billions perished as their sections of reality collapsed into chaos, their bodies and souls claimed by the ruinous powers as the first massive tribute from this virgin universe. But hundreds of millions were successfully translated into the nascent demiplane, preserved within bubbles of ordered reality that gradually connected to form a new coherent whole. As the final phase of the translation completed, the Emperor performed one last crucial operation. With a psychic exertion that would have annihilated any lesser being, he severed the connection between his newly created demiplane and the warp of this universe, creating a self-contained reality that existed with its own internally consistent laws of physics and its own stabilized Imperium protected from the full corruption that had claimed the original universe. The effort nearly destroyed him. Even in his physical prime, the Emperor's form in the Antarctic facility collapsed, his consciousness barely maintaining cohesion as it retreated to the relative safety of his throne in what had once been New York but was now the capital of a pocket universe inhabited by the remnants of humanity. Magnus, sensing his father's peril, disengaged from his battle with Fulgrim with a final devastating psychic assault that temporarily banished the demon Primarch back to the collapsing universe beyond their sanctuary. With the last of his strength, Magnus sealed the final breach between realities before collapsing beside his father, both of them drained beyond the capacity of even their superhuman physiologies to quickly recover. In the aftermath, as the survivors took stock of their new reality, the scope of what had occurred became clear. The Emperor had not saved Earth or the physical universe. Both had been claimed by chaos, transformed into a playground for the ruinous powers and their servants. What he had saved was something more essential, humanity itself, preserved within a pocket dimension that functioned according to laws he had defined. This new Imperium existed in a realm that was neither fully material nor fully immaterial, a demiplane that combined elements of both states in a carefully balanced equation. It had its own internal geography, its own stellar bodies, its own physics, all designed to support human life while remaining resistant to chaos corruption. But it was not the grand vision of human galactic dominance that the Emperor had once planned. It was a lifeboat, a final refuge for a species whose home reality had been lost to powers beyond even the master of mankind's ability to defeat. And it was fragile, dependent on the continued psychic exertion of both the Emperor and Magnus to maintain its integrity. As the Emperor recovered enough consciousness to assess the new reality he had created, he found himself facing choices even more difficult than those that had confronted him in his original timeline. This pocket Imperium had limited resources, limited space, limited potential for expansion. Hard decisions would need to be made about its governance, its development, and its ultimate purpose. The arrival of Dante and his veterans from the 51st Millennium complicated these calculations. They brought with them the cultural weight of 10,000 years of imperial tradition, much of it at odds with the Emperor's original vision. They viewed him as a god, not as the enlightened autocrat he intended to be. They expected miracles, not rational governance, and beyond the boundaries of their artificial reality, the Chaos Gods watched with amused interest. They had claimed a universe, a significant victory by any measure, but the prize they truly coveted, the Emperor, himself and the human souls, under his protection, had slipped from their grasp into a pocket dimension beyond their immediate reach. It was not a final victory for either side, but rather the establishment of a new stalemate on different terms. The Emperor had preserved humanity, but at the cost of its unlimited potential for growth. The Chaos Gods had gained a universe, but failed to claim the adversary who had defied them across multiple timelines. As the Emperor sat upon his throne in the heart of this new pocket Imperium, his thoughts turned to the future. This was not the path he had foreseen when he had first arrived in that virgin universe, not the grand new beginning he had planned. But it was perhaps a chance to correct the mistakes of his first attempt at shepherding humanity. Here, with a clean slate of sorts and the hard-won wisdom of his failures in the original timeline, perhaps he could finally create the perfect human society he had always envisioned. A culture of reason rather than superstition, of unity rather than division, of progress rather than stagnation. Or perhaps history would simply repeat itself, the flaws in human nature and in his own approach reasserting themselves in new but equally devastating ways. Perhaps the cycle of hope, betrayal, and desperate last stands was woven into the very fabric of human existence, inescapable even for a being of his power and foresight. As the demiplane stabilized around him, as the surviving humans began to rebuild their civilization within the constraints of their new reality, the Emperor allowed himself a rare moment of uncertainty. The future was no longer a linear path extending before him, but a closed circle, a pocket of possibility surrounded by the howling madness of a corrupted universe. Within those constraints, what kind of Imperium would emerge? What new forms would the eternal struggle between order and chaos take? And in the final accounting, had his intervention in that virgin universe been its salvation or its doom? These questions had no immediate answers. But as the Emperor of mankind looked out over the remnants of humanity preserved in his artificial creation, he made one unshakable commitment. This time would be different. This Imperium would not repeat the mistakes of the last. This humanity would fulfill its potential even within the limited scope now available to it. And if the Chaos Gods thought they had won a final victory, they would learn, as they had learned so many times before, that underestimating humanity and its immortal guardian was always a grave miscalculation.